All right. Today we are going to be taking a deep dive into some pretty fascinating ideas about relationships and not just the romantic kind.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring some excerpts from Relationship Goals, a book by Michael Todd.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
You might know it from like all the buzz it got on social media, but today we're going to go deeper than the hashtags, you know.
Totally.
So the book tackles relationships from this really interesting Christian perspective. So be prepared for some really unique insights,
Like,
sprinkled with some personal stories from Michael Todd and some biblical principles as well.
interesting.
Well, don't worry, because this isn't about, pushing beliefs on anybody.
Huh.
Think of it more as like a peek into a really interesting lens on a topic that I think we all grapple with,
For sure.
relationships.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool how Michael Todd, connects those personal anecdotes and even pop culture to these biblical principles.
Yeah.
It makes it way more accessible, I think, for people.
Definitely. And he doesn't shy away from his own like ups and downs in his relationships either. Like
Yeah.
like he talks pretty openly about that near breakup he had with his wife Natalie.
Right.
It really makes you think about like rushing into things before you're ready.
For sure. For sure. And that's where this idea of God's plan for relationships comes in.
Hmm.
It's like a core concept in the book, this idea that God has a blueprint for us, not just in romance, but like
Wow.
in all our connections.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
like we're all pieces of this bigger puzzle.
Okay. So how does that like bigger puzzle idea play out in our everyday lives?
Well, Todd really emphasizes having a relationship with God first and foremost,
Okay.
as the foundation. Without that, he says, we're like archers shooting arrows without aiming at a target.
Mm,
We might hit something, but it's not going to be what we truly desire.
that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another point that really caught my eye when I was reading this. He's a big advocate for singleness.
Yes.
Not just as like a waiting room for marriage,
Yeah.
but as this valuable period of growth. Why do you think that resonates so much with people?
I mean, there's so much pressure in society to be coupled up, right?
Totally.
Todd flips the script on that. He says singleness is a time to deepen your relationship with yourself and with God.
Right.
It's like you figure out your own needs, your patterns, what you truly want in a partner, all without the distractions of a relationship.
Hmm.
He even talks about this like dating deficit, how all that casual dating can actually leave you feeling empty. It's like constantly spending energy, but getting no real return on your investment.
Yeah, I can see how jumping from relationship to relationship could actually take you further away from what you're really looking for
That's the idea.
instead of closer.
Yeah. He suggests that intentional dating is like the alternative.
Okay.
It's all about purpose. You're dating with the clear goal of finding a life partner, not just for fun or to avoid being alone.
So it's about shifting your mindset from what am I getting out of this to what kind of foundation am I building?
Precisely. And that shift often starts with intentional friendship.
Okay.
He believes that a strong friendship is actually the key to a lasting romantic relationship.
He tells that story about Brandon and Taylor, right?
Yeah.
They went through this 90-day intentional friendship plan, and boom, they fell in love and ended up getting married. What stood out to you about that story?
I think it really highlights how changing your approach can lead to completely different outcomes.
Yeah.
Their 90 days were all about open communication, setting boundaries, and having meaningful conversations.
Right.
Instead of diving headfirst into romance, they built this foundation of trust and understanding.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
It's really interesting because it challenges the typical, like, spark narrative we see so often.
Oh, totally.
It's more about building something sustainable.
Right. And he even talks about the potential downsides of that recreational dating mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Heartbreak, wasted time,
Mm-hmm.
even moving further away from God.
Mm-hmm.
He uses some pretty powerful stories to illustrate these points.
Yeah. He mentions Valeria and T, whose relationship became more important than their connection with God.
Right.
That definitely leads to some tough questions about priorities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He also talks about Ben, who was engaged to Tina, but realized, thanks to a mentor, that the relationship wasn't in line with his purpose.
Hmm.
It was actually pulling him away from his faith.
So sometimes, even though it's hard ending, a relationship can be a step towards aligning with your values and your spiritual goals.
That's a key point.
Hmm.
It takes courage to walk away from something that's not serving you, even if it's comfortable or familiar.
Yeah. Now, this next topic might be a bit more sensitive, but it's important. He talks about sex and the idea of soul ties. I think we need to unpack this carefully because it's something a lot of people have strong opinions about.
Yeah, you're right. It's a topic that Todd approaches from a biblical perspective,
Okay.
focusing more on guidance than judgment.
Okay.
His stance is that God created sex, but it's intended for a specific context.
Mm.
Within marriage, he talks about sexual immorality, not just as like crossing a line, but as a distortion of how things are designed to be.
Okay, so that's the foundation of his view. Now, what are these soul ties he talks about?
It's this concept that when you're intimate with someone, you create this invisible bond,
Mm.
almost like being married to them on a spiritual level.
Mm.
These ties, he argues, can have a real impact on your future relationships.
Wow, that's a heavy concept. He shares a pretty intense story about Caleb, whose past soul ties caused serious problems in his marriage.
Yeah.
Almost led to divorce, actually.
It's a powerful illustration of how our choices, especially when it comes to intimacy, can have consequences that ripple outward. But here's the important part. He also offers hope.
Okay.
No matter what's happened in the past, he says you can turn things over to God and find healing and freedom.
So it's about recognizing the potential impact of our choices, but not getting stuck in guilt or shame.
Yeah,
There's always a path forward.
exactly. It's about recognizing the power of forgiveness and choosing to move forward in a healthy way.
And this leads perfectly into the next big topic, marriage. He has this interesting equation for it, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 1.
Right.
What's that all about?
He's saying that a whole man plus a whole woman plus God at the center
Okay.
equals one unified marriage. It's like a triangle with God at the top point.
Ah, I see. So the closer each person gets to God, the closer they become to each other as well.
That's the idea. And he makes it clear that becoming one isn't a destination, it's a lifelong journey.
Mm.
It's about constantly growing closer to God and, as a result, growing closer to your spouse.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. He actually challenges the idea that love should come before marriage.
Right.
Like that whole fairy tale thing.
He argues that real love actually develops after marriage,
Okay.
through those shared experiences,
Mm.
the sacrifices, the commitment.
Mm.
It goes against the fairy tale narrative we're often fed, but there's a deep wisdom to it.
Yeah, it does make you rethink all those rom-coms where like everything's perfect after the I do's. It seems like he's saying that real love is less about like fireworks and more about this slow, steady burn.
That's a great way to put it. He even uses this funny anecdote about his early days with Natalie,
Mm-hmm.
emphasizing how crucial it is to understand each other's love languages. You know,
Right.
those different ways we express and experience love.
Right, like words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It reminds me of that saying, what's loving to one person can feel like nothing to another.
For sure.
And he doesn't just stop at understanding.
Mm.
He emphasizes the importance of meeting each other's needs, not as a reward or a bargaining chip,
Right.
but as a fundamental expression of love. He gives some examples too.
Yeah, he mentions how women often need security, affection, and communication, while men tend to need honor, respect, support, and intimacy.
He's careful to point out that those aren't rigid gender stereotypes,
Right.
but rather needs that are woven into our very being. Recognizing and responding to those needs is essential for building a strong foundation in marriage.
He also stresses the power of words, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
He connects it back to that idea of God's plan for relationships,
Mm.
arguing that our words should reflect the love and respect that God has for each of us.
Makes me think about how much damage, like, careless words can inflict.
Oh,
Like that saying words can be like swords.
he offers some practical advice for navigating conflict too,
Okay.
which, let's be honest, is inevitable in any relationship.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
I remember him talking about the importance of articulating those unspoken expectations we all carry around.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes resentment builds because we assume our partner should just know what we need.
Right. And it's not always about what we say, but how we say it.
Yeah.
He encourages us to pay attention to our tone and word choice,
Okay.
to focus on addressing the root cause of the issue rather than just reacting with anger.
It's like choosing to respond rather than react.
Yes.
Taking that pause can make all the difference.
Yeah. Now, here's where Todd gets really insightful.
Okay.
He talks about the paradox of marriage.
A paradox. What does he mean by that?
He compares it to physical fitness.
Okay.
Both are incredibly rewarding and desirable, but they require consistent effort and discipline.
Yeah.
It's not always easy or fun,
Right.
but the long-term benefits outweigh the challenges.
So marriage is this beautiful thing that also takes real work.
Yes.
It's not about finding that perfect person,
Right.
but about two imperfect people choosing to build something meaningful together.
That's it. And he encourages us to embrace that tension, knowing that God can create beauty out of those seemingly contradictory elements.
Then he moves into the topic of children,
Yeah.
and it's not what you might expect. He cautions against using kids to fill voids in a relationship.
He emphasizes that children are a blessing,
Okay.
but they shouldn't be the sole focus of a marriage. The relationship between the husband and wife needs to be the priority.
It's like building a house.
Hmm?
You need a solid foundation before you start adding rooms. He also talks about the challenges of what he calls an incomplete triangle, where one spouse is a believer and the other isn't.
Right, that unequally yoked situation, as it's sometimes called.
Yeah.
He acknowledges the difficulties that can arise from those differing belief systems,
Hmm.
but he also offers encouragement.
Okay.
Hmm.
He shares the story of Brian and Sheila, whose marriage went through a rough patch when Brian drifted away from his faith.
It's a great example of how even those mismatched foundations can be rebuilt with patience, love, and faith.
Yeah.
Ultimately, through Sheila's perseverance and God's grace, their marriage was restored.
It's a reminder that no situation is hopeless, that redemption and healing are always possible.
Absolutely.
But then the conversation takes a tougher turn, shifting to the topic of divorce,
Yeah. Todd doesn't shy away from the hard stuff.
right?
He acknowledges the painful reality of divorce, but emphasizes that it's not God's ideal.
He explains those biblical grounds for divorce, focusing on adultery and abandonment by an unbelieving spouse.
Mm.
But even in those situations, he highlights the potential for lasting damage.
Right.
He uses a powerful analogy to illustrate this.
Yeah, he compares it to ripping apart two pieces of paper that have been glued together. No matter how carefully you try to separate them, there will always be tears and remnants of the bond.
It really drives home the point that divorce leaves scars not just on the couple,
Yeah.
but often on their children and extended families as well.
Mhm.
He urges listeners to fight for their marriages whenever possible and to seek help when they need it.
He makes a really interesting observation about how the divorce rate for couples over 45 is on the rise.
Oh, wow.
He attributes this to the empty nest syndrome, where couples have invested so much in their children that they've neglected to nurture their own relationship.
That's a really important point. It's like they've reached this stage of life and realized they've become strangers to each other.
Exactly. And that's where his advice to date your spouse comes in.
Date your spouse. So, like, after you're married.
That's the idea. It's about keeping the romance alive, carving out time for each other, continuing to learn and grow together. It's about remembering that we are individuals within the marriage,
Okay.
each with our own goals and aspirations, and finding ways to support each other's growth without losing sight of that essential unity.
So it's about finding that balance between being a we and still nurturing our individual selves.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to that concept of intentionality, which seems to be woven throughout the book.
It's like he's saying that whether you're single, dating married, or dealing with the complexities of family and friendships, being intentional is key.
Intentional in choosing our relationships,
Right.
in nurturing those relationships, and in aligning our goals with God's plan.
And ultimately, that intentionality is what leads to those lasting, fulfilling relationships that reflect God's love.
Exactly. It's not about striving for some picture-perfect ideal,
Right.
but about embracing the journey, the ups and downs, the joys and sorrows, knowing that we're not alone.
Knowing that even in the midst of all that messiness, God is with us every step of the way. But how do we keep that big picture in mind when we're stuck in the day-to-day struggles of relationships? Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the little things, and
Wow.
lose sight of that bigger purpose. So what advice does Todd offer for staying grounded in our faith when relationships get tough?
Well, he reminds us that our relationship with God is our anchor.
Okay.
It's the source of our strength, our guidance,
Yeah.
and ultimately our healing. When we're rooted in that relationship, we can weather any storm.
That makes sense.
He also encourages us to turn to our faith community for support.
So it's about leaning into that community, not trying to navigate everything on our own.
Exactly. He talks about the importance of having mentors,
Okay.
accountability partners, and people we can trust to walk alongside us through those difficult seasons.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes we just need someone to listen
Right.
or to offer a different perspective or to remind us of God's truth when we're feeling lost.
He also emphasizes the power of prayer,
Oh, right.
not just as a way to ask for things, but as a means of connecting with God, of surrendering our worries and anxieties,
Right.
and of aligning our hearts with His will.
It's about that two-way communication, that intimate conversation with God that reminds us we're not alone in our struggles.
Now, before we wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch on something that really resonated with me. Todd's dedication to his wife, Natalie.
Oh, yeah.
He calls her his ultimate relationship goal.
Oh, that's so sweet. It
Yeah.
adds this beautiful personal touch to all those principles he's laid out.
Right. It reminds us that behind all the strategies and advice,
Yeah.
there's a real-life love story,
Hmm.
a testament to the power of commitment, forgiveness, and grace.
It makes all those concepts we've been talking about feel more tangible,
Right.
more achievable.
Yeah.
If they can build a strong, loving relationship, maybe we can too.
That's the beauty of it. It gives us hope.
Right.
It shows us that even in the midst of all the complexities and challenges of human relationships,
Mm.
genuine love can thrive.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive,
Hmm.
what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with?
Hmm.
What's that nugget of wisdom they can apply to their own relationships starting today?
I encourage them to remember that relationships are a reflection of God's love.
Okay.
Whether they're single dating, married, or navigating the ups and downs of family and friendships,
Yeah.
their goal should be to embody that love in their interactions,
Mm.
to seek unity, to extend grace, to pursue growth, both individually and together.
Beautifully said. And of course, to prioritize that relationship with God above all else.
Exactly. When that foundation is strong, everything else falls into place more easily.
Oh, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to be more intentional,
Yeah.
more forgiving, and more focused on building relationships that honor God.
Me too. It's been a thought-provoking journey.
Definitely.
And I hope our listener feels empowered to apply these insights to their own life.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into Michael Todd's relationship goals.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope this has sparked some new ideas
Mm-hmm.
and encouraged you to think differently about the relationships in your life.
Yeah,
Remember, lasting, fulfilling connections are possible.
absolutely.
Keep seeking, keep growing, and keep diving deep.